I have always thought that the Bodleian carries its own weather. You step through the gates, and Oxford sky, however it has chosen to brood that day, into something more hushed, more permanent. The rain falls differently there, softened by stone. The light bends across centuries of glass and dust. Even silence has a timbre in that place, a low vibration in the ribs, as though the books themselves are exhaling. I remember it on the morning in question, and I recall, with some reluctance, that I was not reading what I should have been. I had gone ostensibly to trace a fragment of Pindar, or at least that was the pretext. The truth is that I had felt compelled to put myself in the company of books more ancient and more patient than myself. There is a way in which the Bodleian Hall reminds one of one's insignificance, and, paradoxically, I found that comforting. I had settled at one of the long oak tables, my pen resting on the crossword in the Times, when the peculiar thing happened. It was not an event of grand drama, no falling body, no raised voice. Merely the cough of a librarian who had worked there longer than I had lived, and the quiet dragging of her sensible shoes. She carried with her a note, folded and refolded, so that its creases had begun to tear. She set it down, not at my place, but at the far end of the table, beside an open folio of 17th-century sermons. I would not have noticed had the draught from the window not lifted its corner toward me like a beckoning hand. I saw then that the seat was unoccupied. There had been a man there earlier, a thin fellow in an ill-fitting tweed jacket who smelled faintly of pipe tobacco, though I had not seen him smoke. He had glanced once at me, eyes too quick to linger. He had asked the librarian, in a voice almost apologetic, whether a certain tract from the 1630s had been rebound. I paid him little heed at the time. Oxford is filled with men who prefer the company of the dead. But now his absence, sudden and without the shuffle of departure, began to trouble me. I bent my head, pretending to correct a clue in my crossword. 7 down an old word for deceit, 4 letters. The answer slipped in at once. The sound of the librarian's cough would not leave me. It had carried something I could not quite name, a hesitation perhaps, or fear dressed as irritation. I rose and wandered as though to stretch my legs. The hall was quiet as a tomb. Students hunched over piles of notes, the rustle of paper like the sound of distant rain. The sermons lay open still, but the note was gone. Had the librarian retrieved it? Had the man in tweed returned for it, vanishing again without my notice? My memory refused to be precise, and I despised it for that. Later, outside beneath the colonnade, I saw the same librarian speaking to a porter. They thought themselves unobserved, but I caught the way her fingers twisted the strap of her bag, the way his eyes darted to the quadrangle, as though measuring escape. I could not hear their words, only the shape of the urgent clipped swallowed. It would be wrong to say that I knew then what had begun. One does not know in Oxford, one suspects. But the unease has lodged itself in me, and when unease arrives it never travels alone. That evening, after a supper of little consequence, and a glass of whisky more necessary than welcome, I unfolded the crossword again. The clue that had given me no trouble before whispered another meaning. Deceit, yes, but also the machinery of concealment, the structures built to keep truth folded in on itself. A note refolded too many times, a man who left without leaving. The Bodleian has its weather, and I had felt the air shift. I did not sleep well that night. Rain scrawled its long arguments across the window of my flat. I rose twice, pacing, hearing again the cough in the hall, the scrape of shoes. It seemed absurd to attach importance to so little. But absurdity has always been the mask of deeper design. By morning, I had resolved to return. The porter at the gate greeted greeted me with his usual nod, yet there was a flicker behind his eyes, as though he remembered me more vividly than he ought. Inside, the sermons had been closed, shelved, their dust brushed into the silence. No trace of note or man remained. I approached the librarian, her hair coiled in the same severe knot, her eyes rimmed with sleeplessness. I asked, with the casual curiosity of a man hunting for Pindar, whether the folio of sermons had been consulted much lately. Her reply was mechanical, her gaze sliding past me to some point on the wall. "Not in years," she said, "not until yesterday." Then, with the faintest quiver, "Did you happen to see where he went?" I shook my head, though I had seen enough to know he had not left by the door. That was the moment. The quiet cracked, though imperceptibly, like a flaw in glass that will one day spiderweb across the pane. I felt the old itch, the mingling of dread and hunger that begins every case worth remembering. And in the hush of Bodleian Hall, where the air smells of vellum and rain, I understood that something had been misplaced, not only a note, but a piece of the order Oxford guards so jealously. I tell it now with the restraint of hindsight, but at the time I felt it in my bones a crime had already brushed past me, no louder than a cough. It is often said that Oxford conceals its tragedies beneath layers of parchment and custom, as though the weight of its traditions were enough to suppress untidy deaths. Yet the truth has always been more elusive. Sorrow seeps through even the densest vellum, finding its way to the surface in footnotes, marginalia, whispered recollections overheard in the cloisters. I had scarcely shaken the damp from my coat when the news reached me, not in the form of a declaration, but through the muted vibrations of a common room where the dons spoke as men speak in the presence of the unspeakable. The name surfaced only once, and then not again. Dr. Henry Callow, examiner of classics, found lifeless at his desk in St. Jude's College. They said it was his heart, but in Oxford the word heart carries meanings beyond physiology. I walked through the quadrangle, stones slick with rain, and thought about the man. I had met him only twice, and both encounters were touched by an uneasy brilliance. His conversation carried the weight of Cicero, but ended with the abruptness of a slammed book. He had marked generations of students, his comments known for their scathing elegance. One undergraduate told me he had once reduced an entire essay to a single penciled line. "You are clever, but not wise." The room in which he died still bore the aftertaste of ink and burnt coal. The desk, a mass of papers stacked precariously, had not been disturbed. At its centre lay the final script he had examined, and here the quiet sharpened into something unbearable. The last mark of Dr. Callow's hand was not a word, not a grade, but a small cross, placed with unsettling care beside a passage in Greek. I traced it with my eyes, but did not touch it. The ink was still fresh enough to glisten faintly in the lamplight. A cross is an ambiguous symbol. It may mean wrong, or it may mean chosen. In Scripture it speaks of sacrifice in marginal notes. It signals an error. The ambiguity clung to me, and I felt again that subtle shift in weather I had noticed in the Bodleian. Something had pressed against the stillness of Oxford, bending it just enough to reveal its fracture lines. The porter, who stood in the doorway, watched me with a neutrality that verged on studying. His hands were folded, but one thumb rubbed constantly against the knuckle of the other. I asked, without asking, whether Dr. Callow had seemed well in recent days. The porter replied in the manner of men who know more than they can articulate. "He was quieter than usual, sir." And then, after a pause that felt rehearsed, "but he never was one for noise." Noise is another of Oxford's vanishing acts. In the city, sound is swallowed by courtyards, muffled by stone. One could scream in High Street and hear only the echo of one's own breath. That thought accompanied me as I left St. Jude's, the drizzle falling like graphite across the pavement. Later, in my room, I returned to the crossword. It was a foolish habit, perhaps, but one that had rescued me more than once from the abstractions of despair. The clue was simple enough. 11 across, 5 letters, meaning to judge or decide. I wrote in the obvious answer adjudicate, but the space refused it. Too many letters. The correct word, of course, was mark. I sat back, the whiskey glass untouched beside me, the last act of Dr. Callow, his cross inked upon a student's paper, was a mark. Not merely correction, but judgment rendered in the private silence of his chamber, and then he himself was marked, finished, closed like the very text he annotated. It was too neat for coincidence, yet too fragile to bear meaning without further weight. The student whose paper lay before him, what of him, or her? In Oxford, the pronoun matters little. Ambition and fear are distributed evenly across genders. I knew only that the script was bound in blue, the handwriting angular, urgent, as though each word had been written with a pulse racing behind it. I could not recall the name at the top, though I had seen it. Memory, treacherous as always, offered only fragments, an initial perhaps, the suggestion of an L or an R. I dreamt that night of a library in which every book was marked with a cross. I wandered the aisles, pulling volume after volume, each one containing a single line of correction, but no text. At the end of the aisle stood Dr. Callow, his face obscured by shadow, his hand extended not with welcome, but with dismissal. When I woke, the rain had not ceased, and the window rattled as though urging me to move. The next morning, I walked once more into the quadrangles. Students hurried past with their essays clutched to their chests like shields. Their eyes carried the haunted alertness of those who know an examiner has fallen, and who wonder whether judgment is suspended or sharpened by death. One boy muttered to another that it must have been his nerves. No man could read that much Greek without breaking. I said nothing. Inside the hall of St. Jude's, the fellows were gathered in a cluster. Their conversation trickled into my ears in fragments: arrhythmia, family history, unfortunate but not unprecedented. I caught sight of the script again, now sealed in a folder, and knew instinctively that its words were less secure than they appeared. It was then I noticed the dust. On the windowsill beside Callow's desk, a thin layer of dust had been disturbed, not by the sweep of a cloth, but by the pressure of fingertips. 4 parallel lines, faint but undeniable, pressed into the grey. Someone had leaned there recently, watching perhaps, or waiting. The marks were at a height too low for Callow, too high for a child. They suggested a visitor who did not wish to sit, someone who lingered briefly and departed without notice. I did not remark on it aloud. Some observations must remain private, folded inward until they align with others yet to come. Walking away, I thought again of that cross, sharp and black against the paper, a mark that ended one thing and began another. In Oxford, death rarely concludes. And as I stepped once more into the rain, I realized I had crossed from mere curiosity into something more binding. A crime had brushed against me again, and this time it had left its mark. The college hall at St. Jude's has always seemed to me more like a theatre than a dining room. The portraits glare down from their high places, the chandeliers throw their fractured light upon oak tables scarred by knives and careless tankards, and every meal carries with it the faint menace of ritual. One can almost hear the echo of centuries, voices murmuring not in conversation, but in the rehearsal of roles. That evening it was not the roast or the claret that interested me, but the faces. Death, I have often observed, does not silence gossip, it sharpens it. Dr. Callow's passing, cloaked though it was in the official phrasing of natural causes, had lent the hall an atmosphere thick with conjecture. Fellows who would otherwise have eaten in companionable silence now spoke in hesitant asides, their voices dropping to the level of confession. I sat amongst them, not as a guest exactly, nor as a colleague, but as something less definable listener, a presence tolerated by virtue of the college's unease. On my left sat Dr. Fairfax, whose lectures on medieval philosophy were notorious for outlasting the patience of even the most determined students. He leaned toward me, the smell of his pipe clinging to his jacket, and murmured that Callow had been restless in the weeks preceding his death. Restless, he said, though he could not specify what form that restlessness took. Across the table, Miss Davenant, one of the few women among the senior tutors, added with dry restraint that Callow's restlessness was not of the harmless variety. She folded her napkin with a deliberation that seemed too pointed to be innocent. I said little, preferring to let silence draw its own confessions. People will often speak more to a pause than to a question, and indeed it was Dr. Lethbridge, a historian of the late Stuart period, who eventually leaned forward and remarked, almost carelessly, that Callow had been seen in the company of a student not long before his death. The words fell like crumbs on the polished table, and the others glanced at him, then away, as though complicit in a pact not to pursue the matter. The hall itself seemed to collapse in this silence. The creak of benches, the faint clink of cutlery, the occasional coffee sound magnified the absence of the one voice they refused to mention openly. I let my gaze wander to the far end of the table, where the younger lecturers sat, eager to display their indifference, yet betraying themselves with furtive glances and strained laughter. It was then that I noticed the oddity. The place card at the high table, bearing Callow's name, had not been removed. It lay there still beside the empty chair, the ink slightly smudged as though touched by a damp finger. No one had thought to clear it, or perhaps no one had dared. The presence of that small, rectangular piece of card unsettled me more than the conversation. Oxford, for all its composure, had slipped. During the serving of pudding, I withdrew into my thoughts, the crossword folded discreetly beside my plate. 12 down suspect, 6 letters. I wrote in the obvious, but it felt unsatisfying. Then the letters arranged themselves differently. The two words, though opposed, were bound by the same necessity of suspicion. One cannot suspect without the possibility of alibi. I closed the paper quietly, the deduction more telling than I cared to admit. After the meal, as tradition dictates, we adjourned to the common room. Port was poured, the smoke of cigars rose in thin spirals, and the portraits continued their silent surveillance. I took my glass and positioned myself near the fire, listening. The Don's words moved in circles, as though the room itself resisted straight lines. Fairfax repeated his claim of restlessness, Davenant her insinuations, and Lethbridge allowed the student's shadow to hang once more, without naming it. But I had observed enough. It was not what they said, but how they avoided saying more. Each had something to withhold. Fairfax, with his nervous tapping of the stem of his glass, Davenant with her carefully folded napkin, now resting untouched upon her knee, Lethbridge with his too-ready smile. They were not united by affection for Callow, but by a shared reluctance to expose him or themselves. As the evening drew on, I noticed a younger lecturer, Mr. Hughes, seated at the edge of the circle. He said nothing, yet his hands betrayed him. He traced invisible shapes upon his knee, as though copying words from memory. I asked him casually what he taught. Latin epigraphy, he replied, his voice thin but precise. He mentioned that he had assisted Callow with examination papers on more than one occasion. There was the briefest tightening around his mouth when he added that Callow had been difficult to please. When the hour grew late, I stepped out into the quadrangle once more. The rain had ceased, but the stones still glistened, reflecting the lamplight like fragments of broken glass. I paused beneath the archway, listening to the sound of the night, the drip of water, the distant murmur of a student reciting lines to himself, the heavy silence of the chapel bell awaiting its hour. It struck me then that the hall had revealed not just its suspects, but its unwilling witnesses. They were not guilty in the legal sense, perhaps, but each carried within them the knowledge of something withheld. The withheld is always the most dangerous element. Walking home, I reconsidered the crossword clue. Suspect, alibi. To accuse and to excuse. Both demand a witness, and in Oxford everyone is a witness, though few are willing to confess it. I tell it now with the restraint of recollection, but I remember clearly the taste of the port, the warmth of the fire, and the weight of unspoken words pressing upon me. The suspects were in the hall that night, though none of them would admit to being such. And in the empty chair with its untouched place card, Dr. Callow presided still, his silence heavier than all their evasions combined. Music has always been Oxford's second religion. If theology seeks to uncover meaning through words, then music attempts the same through silence arranged into sound. I have often found greater truth in a suspended note than in the long sermons delivered beneath vaulted ceilings. It was fitting, then, that the next turn in this case did not arrive through paper or port, but through a fragment of music left unfinished. I had been persuaded, or perhaps I persuaded myself, to attend a recital in the chapel at St. Jude's. The programme promised nothing more remarkable than Bach and Purcell, but I confess that my motives were less aesthetic than investigative. Callow had been fond of attending concerts, though his enthusiasm was the brittle kind, more an exhibition of discernment than genuine joy. Still, one can learn much about a man from the music he selects, and more still from the music he interrupts. The evening began with rain, striking the leaded windows in long diagonal strokes as though impatient with the order of the score within. The students filed into the stalls with their scores clutched like scriptures, and the organist, a gaunt fellow whose cuffs were frayed despite his elegance, took his seat with a small bow. I noticed in the pews ahead several of the fellows who had sat with me in the hall the previous evening. They pretended to devote themselves to the music, but their eyes wandered, their hands restless on their knees. The performance itself was competent, if not inspired. Bach's counterpoint unfurled like a series of puzzles half solved, each theme calling out to another across the nave. Yet midway through a fugue, the organ faltered. A note hung too long, suspended past the point of harmony, and then collapsed altogether. A ripple moved through the audience, a disturbance subtle but inescapable. The organist recovered swiftly, but the illusion was gone. What should have been seamless was broken, and the silence after each cadence grew heavier. It was in that silence that I heard the whisper. Not from the organ, but from 2 rows behind me, where a pair of students exchanged hurried words. I caught only fragments of the name Callow, spoken with the reverence of fear, and the phrase score unfinished. Their voices died as quickly as they arose, but the damage was done. My attention strayed from the performance to the manuscript laid across the organist's stand. At the close, when the congregation dispersed into the cloisters, I lingered. The organist remained behind, shuffling his scores with irritation. I approached and remarked upon the falter in the fugue. He flushed, muttered about damp pipes, then added with curious defensiveness that the score itself had been tampered with, a page missing, or perhaps misplaced. He could not be certain. His eyes shifted toward the pews where the fellows now gathered in subdued knots of conversation. Tampering with a score seemed too trivial a crime for Oxford, and yet the trivial is often the most telling. I asked whether he had lent the manuscript recently. He replied with a hesitation that betrayed him. Dr. Callow, he said, had borrowed it not a week ago, insisting that he required it for a paper on the mathematical properties of Bach. The organist confessed he had been surprised that Callow's interests lay more in rhetoric than rhythm, but one does not refuse a senior examiner the missing page, the faltered note, the whispered phrase, each fragment aligned with the unease I had felt since the Bodleian. It was not proof, but a pattern of the first outline of a shape still buried in shadow. I walked home beneath the dripping arches, my thoughts drawn as always to the crossword. 6 across a break in continuity, 7 letters. I toyed with rupture, with hiatus, but neither satisfied. Then came lacuna, a gap, a missing piece, the silence within the score. Callow's death was a lacuna. His last mark, a cross on a student's paper, had left more unsaid than declared, and now, in the music, another gap revealed itself, as though Oxford's own score had been interrupted mid-phrase. Later that night, I sat with whiskey in hand, the rain easing into a softer patter against the glass. I thought of the students whispering behind me, their voices taut with knowledge unspoken. One of them had carried a violin case, though there was no violin in the evening's programme. I remembered, too, the organist's evasive glance, the way his fingers trembled as he gathered the sheets. These details, isolated, were nothing. Together they formed the outline of something withheld. I cannot claim certainty, not even in recollection. But I knew then that Callow's end was entangled with more than ink and judgment. It reached into the manuscripts, the music, the interruptions that spoke louder than sound. Oxford breathes in its libraries, but it dreams in its chapels. And on that evening, amidst the faltering notes and the whispered names, I felt the dream shift. The score had been interrupted, and with it the fragile balance of silence and truth upon which the city rests. There are evenings in Oxford when the air itself seems steeped in port. The scent lingers in the panelled rooms, in the folds of velvet curtains, in the very breath of the men who shuffle homewards along cobbled lanes. It is a perfume of tradition, of indulgence, and of weakness. I recall one such evening when the thread of Callow's death drew me from suspicion to something darker temptation, played out in the familiar rituals of wine and women. St. Jude's senior common room was heavy with smoke and laughter that never quite reached the eyes. Glasses clinked, decanters leaned forward like conspirators, and the dons poured measure upon measure of liquid forgetfulness. I had been invited under the guise of courtesy, but I knew well enough that my presence was endured, not desired. The conversation drifted from trivial college politics to subtle nods toward the examiner, who would pour no more. Callow's absence, I realized, was being toasted in the very manner that had marked his life, with sharp wit and sharper wine. At my side, Dr. Fairfax once more leaned in, his teeth stained a pale burgundy. He spoke of Callow as a man undone by appetites, though he was careful not to specify which. Across from us, Miss Davenant sipped slowly, her lips leaving a faint trace on the rim of her glass. She said nothing, but her silence suggested knowledge too costly to expend casually. One might almost think the wine itself held their secrets, its crimson depths absorbing what the tongue would not risk. It was not difficult to imagine Callow here, his glass refilled too readily, his tongue loosened beyond discretion. I pictured him leaning too close to a student, his praise laced with the kind of irony that binds as much as it wounds. A man who marked essays with brutal clarity might mark people too, with glances, with gestures, with desires unacknowledged by the statutes of the college. The evening blurred, as port evenings are designed to do, until the ritual gave way to confession. Dr. Lethbridge, who had earlier hinted at Callow's involvement with a student, grew expansive under the weight of drink. He remarked, with that careless precision men use to mask intention, that Callow's weakness was never gambling, never cards or dice, but the intoxication of admiration. He sought it from women, from pupils, from colleagues alike. And admiration, when denied, curdles quickly into cruelty. I watched as Miss Davenant's hand tightened on her glass at this remark. She set it down with a firmness that betrayed more than irritation. There was history there, written not in words, but in the lines around her eyes. She met my gaze briefly, and in that glance I read both warning and defiance. She, too, had been marked by Callow, though in what fashion I could not then say. Later, in the cool corridor outside, I found myself alone with Hughes, the young lecturer in Latin epigraphy. He carried the smell of port on his breath and a nervous energy in his steps. He muttered that he had seen Callow drink beyond measure in the weeks before his death, and that each glass seemed to fuel an inner war. Willpower, he said, was the only exam Callow ever failed. Then he laughed, though the laugh died quickly. The phrase lingered with me: wine, women, willpower. Three forces, each capable of undoing the strongest mind, and each perhaps bound up in Callow's final days. That night, back in my room, I opened the crossword. 14 down restraint, 8 letters. The word that came unbidden was temperance. Yet the letters refused it. The correct answer, when it revealed itself, was control. A subtler word, less moralizing. Not the virtue of abstinence, but the fragile discipline of mastery. And mastery, once lost, cannot be reclaimed by will alone. I thought then of the missing note in the score, the cross on the examination script, the whispers in the hall. Each detail was a lapse, a failure of control, as if Callow's life itself had become a score interrupted by indulgence. Did he reach for wine when he should have reached for clarity? Did he pursue admiration when he should have chosen silence? These were questions Oxford would not answer for me, but they were questions I could not leave unasked. The following morning, the evidence of indulgence still clung to my coat, the smell of smoke, the faint stain of wine where a careless hand had jostled my glass small tokens of a night spent in half-truths. I walked again through the quadrangle, the stones slick as ever with rain, and thought of Callow's willpower stretched to breaking. It struck me that one need not be poisoned by malice to die in Oxford. One might be undone slowly, glass by glass, word by word, until the heart ceased to distinguish between desire and despair. Yet I could not shake the image of Davenant's tightened hand, her glance like a shield. Wine may dull the tongue, but it sharpens the unspoken. And there, in the quiet of morning, I resolved that her silence was not born of ignorance. She knew something of Callow's last indulgences. She had witnessed or endured more than she wished to declare. Oxford is a city of appetites disguised as virtues. We call them tradition, ritual, discourse. But beneath the varnish lies the same hunger that drives men and women everywhere. Wine, women, and willpower, three lines of a puzzle that, once crossed, begin to reveal their hidden pattern. I tell it now with the stillness of hindsight. But that evening in the common room, amidst the crimson glasses and the suppressed glances, I felt the shape of the case twist once more. What had begun with a cough in the Bodleian had grown into something far more: human weakness, indulgence, and the cost of failing to master them. And at that cost, I felt sure, lay the shadow of Callow's death. There are certain corridors in Oxford where light itself hesitates. The Bodleian, though it welcomes scholars by day, becomes another creature after dusk. Shadows lean differently there. Their edges softer, as though the books themselves were exhaling the dust of centuries. I have walked those corridors more times than I can count, yet on the evening I returned after Callow's death, I felt something unlike familiarity. It was an expectation, as though the place awaited me with a patience more unnerving than hostility. I told myself I was only seeking the sermons I had seen abandoned days before the folio with its brittle pages and its ghost of a missing note. But that was a pretext, no different from the excuses I had offered when pursuing Pindar. What drew me back was the sense that Callow's story remained written in these stacks, concealed in the faint scratches of quills long forgotten, in the marginalia of men who, like him, had measured their lives in commentaries and corrections. The library was nearly empty. A student slept with his head bowed over a lexicon, his breath fogging the gloss of the page. A librarian, not the one I had seen before, moved, silently, his steps softened by years of practice. He nodded to me as though my presence required no justification, and disappeared behind a row of shelves. I was left with the silence, which in Oxford is never truly silent. It is a kind of listening, as though the stone itself had ears. I walked toward the reading desk where I had first seen the folded note. The chair stood vacant. No sermons, no trace of the man in tweed. But upon the desk lay another script open to the first page, where a name was written with angular urgency. The ink was not fresh, yet the impression of haste remained. I stared at the name, though in retrospect I am uncertain whether I recall it with accuracy. What mattered was not the letters, but the fact that the script had been left there, unguarded, as though meant to be found. I did not touch it. In Oxford, what is left in the open is often more dangerous than what is concealed. I leaned instead against the oak, letting the silence fill the spaces where certainty should have been. It was then that I noticed the shadow. Not the common play of candle and column, but a longer, thinner shape stretching across the flagged floor, unmoored from any visible figure. It shifted slightly as though adjusting its weight, and then vanished when I turned my head. I cannot say whether it belonged to a person or to my own imagination, but its impression lingers with me still. Seeking to steady myself, I returned to the crossword folded in my coat pocket. 8 across darkness, 7 letters. The obvious word was shadow, but the clue's phrasing cover for truth suggested otherwise. I tried conceal, then eclipse, but neither fit. The answer, when it came, was obscura. Not mere darkness, but the deliberate shaping of light into secrecy. The library's shadow was no accident, it was intention. I walked the aisles slowly, my fingers brushing the spines of volumes that had survived wars and reformations. Each one carried the scars of hands that had opened it, the faint grease of fingertips long dead. Near the theology section I found a shelf with dust unsettled, a volume displaced and returned not with care, but with haste. I pulled it forward. Inside was a loose leaf, tucked between pages, bearing only a line in Latin, omne verum in umbra late. Every truth hides in the shadows. It was Callow's hand. I knew it, as one knows the voice of a man even when distorted by distance. Sharp, uncompromising, but weighted by something more than scholarship. A warning, perhaps, or a confession. I replaced the page carefully, though my pulse quickened at the thought that others had already seen it. As I stepped back into the main hall, the student who had been sleeping now stirred. He looked at me with eyes too clear for one recently woken. He asked if I was seeking the Callow scripts. His tone was casual, but the question was too precise. I replied only that I was looking for fragments, for traces. He smiled faintly, then returned, his head to the lexicon as though retreating behind its fortress of words. When I left the Bodleian, the rain had begun again, soft but insistent. The streets shone like black marble, the lamplight fractured into amber pools. I walked slowly, aware of footsteps behind me that echoed mine with just enough delay to unsettle. I did not turn. One learns in Oxford that shadows are not always to be confronted directly. They follow, they linger, and only later does one discern whether they belong to a man or to the imagination of a city steeped in secrecy. That night in my room, I thought again of the line, "Every truth hides in the shadows." Callow had chosen his words with intent. He had marked students with cruel precision, but he had marked himself too in ways more final than any examiner's cross. What shadow concealed his truth? Was it in the student whisper in the hall, the missing page of the score, the glass raised too often? Or was it in the library itself, where knowledge, once unearthed, carries the power to unmake those who uncover it? I cannot claim certainty even now, but I remember clearly the shape of that evening, the silent listening, the displaced book, the Latin line pressed like a wound into the page, and most of all, the shadow that lingered too long, refusing to explain itself. The library does not forget. It waits, it listens, it marks. And in its shadow, Callow's truth remained, half hidden, demanding pursuit, yet mocking the pursuer. I tell it now in the hush of recollection, but I know that the case did not truly begin with the cough in Bodleian Hall. It began with the shadow that followed me out into the rain, whispering that Oxford's truths are never found in daylight, but only in the places where silence bends and the light fails. There is always a moment in an investigation when the mind, weary of ambiguity, seizes upon a shape it mistakes for certainty. It is a dangerous moment, though often a necessary one, for without the illusion of solution one would never continue the search. I recall with precision the night I succumbed to my first false answer in the matter of Dr. Callow. It came to me, not in the library nor in the hall, but in the quiet of my own rooms, where the rain beat a syncopated rhythm against the panes and the whisky sat neglected beside me. The day had been long, too many faces speaking too little truth, and my thoughts, exhausted, sought a pattern they could claim. The fragments gathered like shards of glass upon a table. The cross on the examination script, the missing page of the score, the whispers of a student, the line in Latin concealed between the shelves. Each fragment cut differently, but I forced them into a single mosaic, pleased with the illusion of coherence. My solution was that Callow had discovered dishonesty in a student's script plagiarism, perhaps, or some deeper fraud. He had marked it with a cross, his last judgment, and in so doing had sealed his own fate. The student, desperate, tampered with the score, perhaps to signal a hidden connection, perhaps to threaten. The note in Latin was Callow's attempt at cryptic confession, an acknowledgement that truth hides in shadow. And so, in the darkness of his chambers, either by his own despair or by another's hand, he met his end. It sounded convincing enough, and I allowed myself the comfort of believing it for the length of a cigarette. The smoke curled into the air like certainty dissolving, yet even as I wrote the pieces down in my notebook, I saw the fractures, too neat, too symmetrical. Oxford never offers symmetry, it offers contradiction. Still I pursued the illusion as one must. I returned the next day to the quadrangle, where the fellows of St. Jude's walked with their gowns trailing like shadows. I confronted Lethbridge with a remark about academic dishonesty, watching for the flicker of recognition. He smiled too quickly, denied too readily. Fairfax, when asked, muttered that students cheat in every generation and that Callow had been merciless with them. Davenant, her silence sharper than their words, looked away entirely. For a few hours I felt the case align. My crossword that afternoon offered encouragement. 9 across mistaken belief, 5 letters. The word fitted cleanly error. How easily the mind converts suspicion into knowledge and knowledge into certainty. But it was an error. The truth of my false solution revealed itself in the smallest of gestures. I had left the chapel and was crossing the cloisters when I encountered Hughes, the young lecturer, carrying a bundle of papers. He greeted me politely, but as he passed, a page slipped from his grasp. I bent to retrieve it. On it was a musical annotation, lines of Bach notated with Latin marginalia. Not the hand of a student, nor of Hughes himself, but the unmistakable hand of Callow. Why should Callow's notes appear among Hughes's papers? The student I had accused in my imagination was absent here. The suspicion I had nurtured dissolved like sugar in rain. Hughes coloured slightly, snatched the paper, muttered something about assisting with editorial work. I let him go, but I knew my solution had fractured. That evening I sat once more with the crossword. 12 down answers that misleads, 13 letters. I struggled until the letters fell into place, misconception. The puzzle mocked me. My beautiful theory was no more than a misconception, a shadow mistaken for substance. I poured myself a drink and stared at the darkened window. I saw my own reflection there, distorted, as though the city itself laughed at my haste. False solutions are not wasted, I reminded myself. They are necessary detours, proving by their collapse that the path continues elsewhere. Yet the collapse carried its own bitterness, for I had allowed myself to believe, and belief, once lost, leaves an ache. I tell it now with the calm of hindsight, but I remember the night as heavy, oppressive. The air in my room seemed not to circulate, as though even the walls withheld their breath. Outside, footsteps echoed and vanished, reminding me that Oxford never sleeps. It only turns its secrets from one corridor to another. The first false solution had failed me, but in its failure it had given me something more enduring, the certainty that Callow's death was not an accident of indulgence, nor a student's desperate crime, but a pattern deeper, more deliberate, written in the margins of music and manuscripts alike. And so I rose the next morning, weary yet steadier. I folded my notebook, crossed out the neat lines of my discarded theory, and left a single word at the top of the page, shadow. For it was in the shadow, not in the light of false clarity, that the truth of Callow's end must be sought. There are nights when Oxford seems intent on reminding you that it has outlived countless men, and that you are merely another temporary custodian of its secrets. I felt it most acutely the evening I returned to St. Jude's, summoned not by invitation, but by a compulsion I could neither explain nor refuse. Somewhere in the folds of its shadows a truth had been folded too carefully to ignore, and I had become its reluctant reader. The library was not my destination this time. Instead, I found myself directed toward the Fellows' Archive, a room less grand than the Bodleian, but perhaps more dangerous for being private. Its oak door creaked with the reluctance of centuries. Within, the air held the tang of leather and iron clasps, the faint bitterness of documents that had been handled with too much reverence. A porter, whose face I had seen many times without remembering, unlocked the room with exaggerated ceremony. He told me the key had been requested earlier that day by Hughes, the young lecturer, but not returned. He shrugged as though this were nothing, but I caught the hesitation in his eyes. Men in Oxford rarely lie outright. They merely allow their pauses to carry the weight of deception. Inside, the archive seemed less like a repository than a confession booth. Papers were stacked unevenly, folios leaned against one another with a precarious intimacy, and dust patterns betrayed recent disturbance. I followed the faintest trailer shelf left fractionally ajar, a ledger not quite closed, and found myself before a volume of student examination records. The binding was loose, its spine cracked in places, as though resisting the years of scrutiny it had endured. I opened it. The pages whispered in protest. There, between two folios, lay a sheet that did not belong. Its paper was of a different grain, its ink fresher, its lines crowded with annotations in Callow's hand. A hidden page, though hidden badly, as though whoever placed it had been more intent on haste than secrecy. The words upon it were not corrections, not the neat condemnations with which Callow was known to mark. They were fragments of music intertwined with commentary, measures of Bach scored alongside Latin phrases. At the margin, faint but legible, he had written "Discipulus est testis." The student is a witness. I stood there for some time, the words pressing against me with a weight disproportionate to their ink. A witness to what? To error? To indulgence? To crime? Or to a truth Callow could not bear to reveal directly? The hidden page was no mere annotation. It was testimony folded into the records like a body buried beneath the floorboards. I closed the volume gently and looked around the room. The shadows deepened toward the corners, and in one I thought I saw the suggestion of movement, though perhaps it was only my own breath disturbing the dust. Still, the sense of being observed remained, clinging like a second skin. Later in my room, I unfolded the crossword as though it might interpret what I had seen. 16 across concealed documents, 9 letters. The word formed itself slowly, as if reluctant to betray its meaning palimpsest. A page overwritten, a truth layered beneath another, never wholly erased. The crossword had named it precisely. The hidden page was not the record itself, but the truth inscribed beneath its surface. I recalled Hughes's nervous grasp when I retrieved Callow's annotated score from his papers. The young lecturer had handled it not with guilt, but with fear. Now I understood that he had been entrusted with fragments Callow wished not to lose, but to conceal. Whether Hughes was complicit or unwilling, I could not yet know. But the pattern had begun to sharpen. Callow had scattered his truth across the city like breadcrumbs, folded in libraries, in music, in records. The rain began again that night, tracing thin rivers down the glass. I sat listening, the hidden page vivid in my mind. It is a strange sensation to know one holds in memory a thing that should not exist, a thing that others would prefer to remain undiscovered. I poured a glass of whiskey, though the comfort it offered was negligible, and thought again of the Latin line. The student is a witness. If that were true, then the whispers I had overheard in the chapel carried greater weight than I had realized. I tell it now with the calm of recollection, but then I felt the unease thickening as though the city itself resisted my pursuit. Each step I took toward clarity seemed to darken the air, to stretch the shadows longer. Yet the hidden page had spoken. It demanded not resolution, but acknowledgement. And I, reluctant though I was, had become its reader. Oxford keeps its truths pressed between its pages, waiting for the hand that dares to turn them. That night I knew I had turned one too many. And somewhere, in the silence beyond the rain, another hand had already begun to turn the page after me. There are confessions that arrive not in words but in gestures, and it is only later that one recognizes them for what they were. Oxford teaches you to listen as much with your eyes as with your ears, for truth here rarely declares itself openly. It was in this way that I first began to sense the outline of a woman's regret, quiet reluctance, and waited with more silence than speech. The day had been a blur of corridors and rain. I had spent hours retracing my own steps, the library with its displaced folios, the archive with its hidden page, the chapel where notes faltered. Each place yielded fragments, but never the whole. By evening I found myself once again in the senior common room, where the fire burned with unnecessary enthusiasm, as though determined to chase away the damp that clung to our coats. The dons gathered, their glasses raised, but it was Miss Davenant who drew my attention. She sat apart from the others, her profile outlined against the flames. There was a restraint about her that did not match the chatter of her colleagues. While Fairfax laughed too loudly and Lethbridge gestured too broadly, she folded her hands with a composure too studied to be natural. Her eyes, though directed toward the fire, flicked once toward me, and in that flicker I recognized the weight of something unsaid. I approached without haste, offering nothing more than a remark about the weather. She replied with a smile that did not travel to her eyes. We spoke, as Oxford people do, of books and students and examinations, but beneath her words lay an undercurrent I could not ignore. At one point she paused, as though tempted to cross the boundary into candour, but then she sipped her wine instead. That hesitation said more than her conversation. Later, as the others dispersed into the night, she lingered in the corridor. I walked beside her in silence until she spoke. "He was not an easy man," she said. The words were measured, but her voice carried the faint tremor of memory. I asked nothing, for in Oxford, questions often silence what might otherwise emerge unbidden. She continued almost to herself that admiration is a dangerous appetite and that Callow had hungered for it in ways that harmed not only himself, but those around him. The regret was not in her words, but in the way she held them back. I understood then that she had known him more closely than she wished to admit, perhaps more closely than the statutes of St. Jude's would have approved. Whether affection, pity, or something more ambiguous had bound her to him, I could not tell. But she carried his absence as though it were a weight pressing against her every movement. That night I returned to my room with her words lodged in me like a shard. I unfolded the crossword, searching for distraction. 10 down sorrow for the past, 6 letters. The answer was obvious regret. But as I wrote it, I saw her face again, the tension in her hand as she set down her glass, the glance she cast toward me that seemed to ask whether silence could ever be confession enough. It was too neat to imagine her as the cause of Callow's downfall. Life is rarely so obliging. Yet I knew her regret was not a fabrication. It had been etched into her gestures, her silences, the controlled precision of her speech. She regretted something, whether an action taken, an action withheld, or simply the failure to resist a man's collapse. I could not yet know. The following afternoon I saw her again in the cloisters. The rain had eased, and a pale sun fell across the flagstones, lending the place a deceptive calm. She greeted me with the same composure as before, but her eyes betrayed a fatigue deeper than sleeplessness. We walked together for a few minutes, our conversation circling harmlessly around the college's lectures. Then, almost absently, she remarked that Callow had once spoken of leaving St. Jude's, of abandoning the examinations altogether. He had said he was tired of being the man who only ever marked others, never himself. I asked when he had said this. She hesitated, then replied that it had been not long before his death. And then, quietly, she added, "I told him he could not escape what he had made of himself." She fell silent, and no amount of patience on my part could coax her further, but in her words I heard the echo of judgment, gentle, perhaps, but final. That evening I considered what she had told me. Callow, the examiner who marked everyone with merciless clarity, had spoken of abandoning his post, and Davenant, with whatever bond tied her to him, had refused him that escape. Her regret was not merely for his death, but for the role she had played in closing the door when he had sought to open it. The pattern of the case shifted again. It was no longer only about a student's script or a missing page of music. It was about the collapse of a man who had tried to flee his own shadow and found no sympathy where he most sought it. I poured myself a drink and looked again at the crossword. Regret. 6 letters that seemed too few for the complexity of her silence. I thought of the hidden page in Callow's hand, the line that named the student a witness. Perhaps she too was a witness, though unwilling. A witness not to his crime, but to his despair. I tell it now with restraint, but at the time her silence pressed upon me with an almost physical weight. A woman's regret had entered the case, not as evidence, not as confession, but as a shadow cast across everything else I had discovered. And shadows, as I had already learned, are where Oxford hides its truths. Her silence remained with me as I walked home through the damp streets, the cobblestones slick beneath the dim lamps. The air smelled of rain and stone, of a city that has borne centuries of unspoken grief, and I knew, though I could not yet prove, that her regret was another thread in the tapestry of Callow's end. A woman's regret, muted, private, unyielding, had become part of the case, and, like all regrets, it was both explanation and evasion, a truth revealed only in shadow. There is a certain cruelty in Oxford's devotion to continuity. The college insisted the examinations proceed, even as the shadow of Callow's death lingered in every corridor. Scripts were gathered, desks laid out, invigilators appointed, all with the precision of a ritual designed to ward off disruption. But rituals cannot silence unease. In the morning I entered the hall where the candidates had begun their work. The air smelled not of ink and paper, but of fear made tangible. The desks stretched in rigid rows, each bearing its blue script book, its sharpened pencils, its promise of judgment. The silence was broken only by the faint scrape of pen against page, a sound that has always struck me as both intimate and public thoughts revealed under compulsion, lines drawn in haste, the soul made legible for a reader who will never grant absolution. At the front sat the invigilator, Hughes, his face pale under the gaslight. His hands trembled slightly as he counted the time, tapping the table with a rhythm he could not control. His nervousness might have passed for inexperience, but I had seen his composure fracture before. I watched him too closely, perhaps, and in watching him I nearly missed the true disturbance. It came not with a cry, but with the sudden halt of movement. A student in the 3rd row had stopped writing. His pen lay upon the paper, and his eyes were fixed on the script before him. Slowly, almost reverently, he raised his hand to show the invigilator. I moved closer. On the paper, among the lines of Greek verse that he had been tasked to translate, there was a stain. Not ink, darker, thicker, coagulating even as I stared. Blood. A smear across the margin, as though some unseen hand had dragged itself over the page. The student whispered that he had opened the script fresh at the start of the examination, that the mark had already been there. The room stirred with unease. Hughes hurried forward too quickly and snatched the script from the boy's desk. He muttered something about accidents, about a careless hand with a pen, but the colour of his face betrayed him. I took the paper gently from his grasp. The stain was no accident. It had seeped from the top corner where the cover had been pierced, and it bore the unmistakable imprint of a fingertip, pressed in haste. I asked to see the stack of remaining scripts. Reluctantly, Hughes led me to the front desk. I opened them at random. Most were untouched, but one, near the bottom of the pile, bore another trace fainter, a smudge along the edge, as though brushed by the same hand. The invigilator insisted he had distributed the papers exactly as delivered. The porter, when summoned, swore he had carried them sealed from the bursar's office. Yet someone had touched them. Someone had left a mark. Not ink, not wine, but blood. That evening back in my room I stared at the stained script as though it might speak. It smelled faintly metallic, the way rain smells when mixed with rust. I laid it beside my crossword, and the juxtaposition struck me with cruel clarity. 4 across evidence of crime, 5 letters. The answer was stain. I sat for hours, the whiskey untouched, considering what it meant. Blood on the examination papers, a gesture, deliberate or desperate, that transformed the scripts from academic exercises into testimony. Callow's last mark had been a cross now. Another had inscribed a different, judgmentless, precise, more primal. It was as though the very act of examination, of testing and marking, had been carried into the realm of flesh. The next day I sought out Miss Davenant. I showed her the paper. She flinched, almost imperceptibly, then mastered herself. She asked whether I believed it to be Callow's own blood. I replied that I did not know. She whispered that he had complained, in his last weeks, of cuts on his fingers from the endless scripts, of ink mingled with blood, until he could no longer tell the difference. She said it with a kind of bitterness, as though his complaints had been less about pain than about theatre. Her words returned me to the hidden page I had found in the archive, the line declaring that the student is a witness. Perhaps this was what he had meant, that the evidence of his despair would be borne not in his own notes, but in the very scripts of those he examined. A grim poetry, fitting for a man who had lived by marking others. Still, I could not escape the unease that someone else had placed the paper in that stack deliberately. Hughes's haste, the porter's evasions, the fellow's silences all pointed to hands that were not Callow's. The stain might have been his, but the placement was not. That night, sleep eluded me. I heard again the scrape of pens in the hall, the sudden stillness when the blood was revealed. I dreamt of rows upon rows of students, each turning their pages to find not questions, but crimson fingerprints, as though the entire examination were an autopsy. I woke before dawn, the crossword still open beside me. 17 down false clue, 6 letters. The answer was red herring. I almost laughed at the irony. Was the blood no more than a distraction, a grotesque performance meant to divert me? Or was it the only true evidence, left too boldly to be mistaken for anything else? I tell it now with the calm of hindsight, but in that moment I felt the case twist into something far colder. Callow's death was no longer only about indulgence, regret, or hidden pages. It was about intrusion, about someone who had reached into the sanctity of examination, the very ritual upon which Oxford prides itself, and turned it into theatre. Blood on the examination papers, a gesture at once intimate and public, accusation and confession, evidence and performance. And though I could not yet see whose hand had left it, I knew the stain would not wash out easily. Not from the scripts, not from the college, and not from my memory.